Perhaps you have already listened to what I have had to say about St. Francis. At least I hope so. If not, I perhaps might suggest that you do so right now, or at least before you listen to what I have to say about St. Thomas. That's because I would like to begin this little talk by drawing some comparisons for you between these two great men. And if I pay close attention to my notes here, it's because I want to be very, very careful in what I have to say about both of them, but especially in this talk about St. Thomas. But first, a similarity, and I suppose an obvious similarity at that. Both men were saints. I suppose I really needn't remind you of that. But what might be worth a reminder is something else, really, that I suppose should be obvious, namely that these saints were men before they were saints. And one more thing, a saint may be made of any and every sort of man. St. Francis and St. Thomas are certainly proof of that, if of nothing else. Now, this might be the obvious moment to begin talking about the differences between them. But it isn't. I first need to say something about the role that saints play in our lives. You see, the saint is actually a medicine, and he is that because he is an antidote. Indeed, that is why a saint is often a martyr, and he is that because a saint can often be mistaken for a poison, because he is an antidote. No matter the age, a saint will generally be found restoring the world to sanity by whatever it is that the world seems to be neglecting at the moment, which, needless to say, is not the same element in every age. What's so amazing about this is that each age seems to seek its saint almost by instinct. I might even say it's almost providential. I say this because the saint being sought is not necessarily the saint that people want, but rather the saint that people need. Therefore, it is the paradox of history that each generation finds itself being converted by the saint that contradicts it most. This reminds me of the phrase, and I'm sure you know it, "Ye are the salt of the earth." Why? Because the saint is the salt. After all, what does salt do? It seasons and preserves the beef. And it does so not because it is like beef, but because it is so very unlike beef. Now, how does this notion apply to Saints Francis and Thomas in our time? Well, St. Francis had a curious, almost uncanny attraction for 19th century Victorians. In fact, he was the only medieval Catholic who ever became popular in Victorian England on his own merits. And why? Because there was a subconscious feeling among Victorians that they had neglected those merits that St. Francis had in abundance. As a result, the English middle class found their missionary figure in the type of person whom they most otherwise despised, namely an Italian beggar. And here in the 20th century, we find ourselves living in a world that has neglected reason. So what do we do but clutch at Thomistic rational theology? In sum, in a Victorian world that was too stolid, too smug, and too material, Christianity returned in the form of a vagabond and a beggar. And in our time, a time when the world has grown much too wild, not to mention highly irrational and thoroughly sentimental, Christianity is returning in the form of a teacher of logic. And who needs Thomistic logic more than the modern intellectual? He certainly needs it more than the common man. What did Thomas do but affirm the goodness of creation against the Manichaean doctrine of evilness? He also defended the common sense of the ordinary man's daily experiences. The Manichees identified purity with sterility, while Thomas identified purity with fruitfulness. At the base of his philosophy is his praise of life, his praise of being, his praise of God, the creator of the world. So, in spite of the contrast between Francis and Thomas, between the vagabond and the student, between the book hater and the book lover, between the wildest of the missionaries and the mildest of all professors, the great fact of medieval history is that these two great men were doing the same great work, one of whom worked in the street, Francis, and the other who worked in the study, Thomas.